what you see is what you get. He is the real deal. Forget Fangraphs. Suck it, StatCast. For the scoop on the NL Central, it's time to open the files at Central Intelligence, an OK Baseball podcast presented by Slasher Sports. New episodes are available Thursday mornings on the OK Baseball podcast feed, on Spotify, and on the OK Baseball podcast YouTube channel. I am your host, Steve Feck. Thanks for coming back for our second episode of Central Intelligence. Don't let looks fool you. There is intelligence within this podcast, within this program. For those that watched the first podcast, you probably are kind of getting the feel that my approach to this, talking about the NL Central, is one part Jagoff and one part little kid in the backyard playing wiffle ball with his friends and recreating, the magic and excitement of your favorite teams, your favorite division, whatever it would be. I don't want to be the crotch of the old man. I don't want it to be your standard look at the league. Yes, we will break down, every week that was. That's what we're going to call the segment, the week that was. We will do that. But I want to engage you and start thinking about what makes you a baseball fan. Why do you follow a certain team in the NL Central? Or why are you interested in the particular topic? I mean, think of yourself down at a desk and you're thinking about making a trade of your baseball cards. Do you trade a potential Hall of Famer for 10 of your favorite players' cards that you don't own yet as you're completing your set? So it's a little bit of nostalgia, a little bit of what's going on today. We don't talk a lot of analytics here. We really just talk about what the game results are and what it might mean for teams in the NL Central and for MLB in general, because the NL Central, especially this year, they're going to be a very interesting player at the table come the trade deadline and building up to that. There are teams that are going to be sellers, perhaps, or at least they're going to sell some veteran players. There are teams that are going to have to make decisions about whether or not they're going to go for it or not. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here with the NL Central going forward. And I think Central Intelligence is the perfect place to start your research. I'm not the end all and be all of NL Central baseball, but I think we'll give you a lot to think about here. And that's what we try to do for Slasher Sports and the OK Baseball podcast programs that are out there. Let's talk about the week that was. Over the past 10 games, we're going to talk about it in like 10 game segments. You may not be listening to this when it first drops on a Thursday. You might get to it over the weekend or later in the week or whatever it would be. That's the great thing about it being available in podcast form on Spotify and on the OK Baseball podcast YouTube channel. It's on demand. It's on your time. So I'm going to try to talk about 10 game segments and keep that in mind as we talk about things, because I might talk about something, refer to something, you'd be like, but wait a minute, this just happened. We're talking about a week that was, and in this case, we want to take a look at the teams over a 10 game span, because I think that gives you a good indication of what might be happening going on. And we'll start at the top of the division with the Milwaukee Brewers. As we record this, they are 29-26. They are 5-5 over their last 10 games. They continue to be a bit hit and miss, from an offensive standpoint. They certainly have some interesting weapons there. Rowdy Tellez has been just, he's like a different player than he was coming up and with Toronto. Owen Miller's been playing terrific. Christian Yelich seems to be finding his stroke again. The Brewers, are going to be a really interesting team, but they have not found that consistency yet. Willie Adames has not really hit. Again, he's on the IL now after that scary incident, being hit in the head with the foul ball hit into the dugout. Hopefully, everything came out looking pretty normal, so he should be back with the team, ideally within the next 7 to 10 days. But the real problem with the Brewers is, the injuries, especially to their starting pitching. Their bullpen has been terrific. I mean, Devin Williams, everybody knows about them, but Straczynski, Bryce Wilson, Joel Payamps, uh, they've all just turned in. What you have to look at is career years for all of those players I just mentioned. But eventually, that can catch up with the bullpen. Eventually, they're going to have to find solutions as far as replacements go for their starting rotation. They ran out this evening, as I'm recording this, the fossil remains of Julio Teheran, the former Braves prospect. He's a talented pitcher. He's never been able to string things together. He looked good in the game against the Blue Jays that I was just referencing. Went 6+, but I don't know how often he can repeat that. So the Brewers are going to have some tough decisions leading up to the trade deadline. I don't know that they can really wait that long to address their starting pitching issues, but they're top of the division. But right on their heels are the Pittsburgh Pirates, who have been leading the NL Central for a good part of the 2023 season already. They continue to make believers out of baseball fans. They're even making believers out of Pittsburgh baseball fans who have been through a lot. I live in Pittsburgh. I've been here through all the really dark times. There was a little renaissance, around 2013 to 2015, 2016. But there's always that cynicism. Oh, they're going to sell off their players. Oh, it's another rebuild. The Pirates are out of their rebuild. Ben Cherington has done an under the radar job restocking the farm system, bringing the young players up, and also adding some veterans like Rich Hill and Carlos Santana and Andrew McCutchen to the mix to help teach these young guys how to win. So the Pirates had a 4-6 10-game stretch. I thought they played the Seattle Mariners really tough. On the road, I thought they played them really, really tough. They could easily have won that series if a couple of things had broken the right way. They took 2 or 3 from the Giants as we record this. So the Pirates, people need to keep an eye on them. Are they going to sell some veterans at the deadline? I would imagine Rich Hill is gone. I would imagine Carlos Santana is gone, but they have the talent, at the upper levels of their minor league system, and probably their best prospects are actually at AA and below. So the Pirates are out of their rebuild. They just need to try to find some consistency here and go forward from there. Andrew McCutchen, what a brilliant signing that was to bring Andrew McCutchen back. That was just terrific. And by the way, if the playoffs started as we record this, the Brewers would host the Buccos in the wild card round. Who would have thought of that? Now, I have been saying, in various outlets and talking with friends and people here at OK Baseball Podcast and Slasher Sports, that the Brewers, for me, they were always going to win the NL Central. I wasn't buying into the Cardinals. We'll talk about the Cardinals here in a little bit. I thought the Brewers had what it takes. They're treading water, surviving, the injury bugs, but imagine that, Pirates and Brewers. Everybody's, oh, the NL Central, they suck. They're terrible. I don't even know why. It's not fair. Well, with the balanced schedule, in essence, everybody's getting a shot at everybody else. But the NL Central is showing that these teams are not as bad as analytic darlings might be pointing out to them. Another really fascinating team is the Cincinnati Reds. And we're going to talk about them in next week's Central Intelligence podcast. I think there are 2 teams that need to go for it this year and that have the weapons, especially in the minor league systems, to be able to add some pieces going into the trade deadline and after the All-Star break. Reds are 25-29. They were 6-4 over the last 10 games. The highlight being really a complete weekend dominance over the Cubs. They're scoring runs. Diaz is a shutdown bullpen weapon. He has been better than advertised. He has been really terrific. He's been consistent. And the scary thing when you look at their lineup, you've got, they called up Matt McClain, TJ Friedel's healthy, you got Spear, Jonathan India, all these young players, and they still have their best weapon in the minors in De La Cruz. We haven't even seen the best of their pitchers yet. I mean, we've seen Williamson and some other guys come up, but we haven't even seen the best of what the Reds have. So that's why that makes them a very interesting team. I don't think anybody wants to play the Reds now, especially if they're having some pitching questions or pitching concerns. This team can hit, and they're hitting on the road as well as at home. I mean, Great American Ballpark. Everybody says, "Oh, it's a bandbox, it's a good hitters park," which is true. But I mean, the Reds are hitting whether they're home or away, and they don't seem to be intimidated facing top of the rotation pitchers either. So the Reds are interesting. They had a really good week. Cubs did not. We talked about how they really were just, I don't want to say embarrassed by the Reds, but if you're the Cubs, you're hoping that all the additions that they added are going to help you take care of business within the division, and the Cubs have not necessarily done that as much. They haven't won 2 straight games since the middle of April. Too many things I think have to happen for the Cubs to really get in this NL Central race. I think they'll hover around 500, as the season progresses. But they need to have some help. They need to have some things go wrong for other teams. I think for them to get into it. Same is the case with the St. Louis Cardinals. And all you Cardinal fans that are tuning in, it may seem like I have some kind of thing against the Cardinals. I really don't. I respect the tradition of the Cardinals. I respect what used to be, the Cardinal way. I think they've really gotten away from that. Now, a lot of the problems exist in the dugout, for the Cardinals. I don't want to dwell too much on that, but you lose 2-3 to the Cleveland Guardians, and then you get shut out by I think by record they're the second worst team in Major League Baseball, the Kansas City Royals, who really just don't hit. Give up 7 runs to them. You've got a pitching problem, and not just in the bullpen. You've got a starting rotation issue. Adam Wainwright is one of the greats, or he was one of the greats. I think age and injury have just caught up with him over time. Some pitchers just kind of have that fall off the cliff kind of year as their career ends, and I think Wainwright might be in the middle of that. Jack Flaherty, he's so talented. He may be inconsistent. I think coming back from the arm injury that he has had, I think it takes pitchers some time to recover. And I think he has shown flashes. I think he's almost there. His command is not there yet. The Cardinals need to stop sitting on their plethora of outfielders. They need to move an outfielder or two. They need to get some help with that rotation, or the Cardinals are just going to spin their wheels all year long. And I don't think anyone, 99% of the baseball public thought the St. Louis Cardinals were the runaway winner in the NL Central. I certainly didn't foresee them being this bad, but as I said at the top here of this segment, I thought the Brewers were the clear favorite in the NL Central. It's kind of working out that way, and the Cardinals need to figure some things out. I think you may see before the end of the summer. I think you could very well see a replacement in the dugout. There hasn't been the dreaded vote of confidence come out yet, but I think once that comes out, you need to start looking at resumes of managers that might be available, and that will uh, perhaps mean the Cardinals need to do what much of this division has already done. If you think about going into a rebuild, I mean, they certainly have talent in their farm system, but maybe they've aged. They have a lot of aging stars on this roster. Maybe it's time to take a step back, let the other teams float near the top for a while, and then kind of rebuild that organization back to the Cardinal way. As we were talking about the Cubs earlier, I think I want to talk about Marcus Stroman. There are a lot of polarizing players throughout Major League Baseball. Among pitchers, I think Marcus Stroman by far is the most polarizing pitcher in Major League Baseball. Cubs have him signed for 3 years, so he's earning $25 million a year. So you would think only the big market teams or only sure contenders would perhaps be able to take him on this contract. It runs through 2024. But then you also know that there's going to be some fan bases and some teams they're going to be turned off by Marcus Stroman's confidence in himself and his personality. I cover the Toronto Blue Jays for another site. Marcus Stroman was run out of town basically by the new administration there in Toronto, Mark Shapiro and Ross Atkins, because he spoke up. And he offended the sensibilities of many Blue Jay fans because he was so vocal. Now, if you're 5'7", and I even think that's generous to say he's 5'7", you can have a little bit of a chip on your shoulder. But Marcus Stroman, what you see is what you get. He is the real deal. He has supreme confidence in himself. Absolutely. And going home, if you will, to New York when he was added by the Mets, you would have thought that would be a marriage made in heaven. There are things that have not come out, and I don't know that they'll ever come out. But obviously, Marcus Stroman is pretty upset about the way he was either treated, the way he was used, or the way that he was discarded and regarded as disposable by a Mets team, on the rise. A lot of people are making a big or crowing about, Stroman, he was a hot dog, pounding on his chest, pointing at the Mets dugout. Basically saying, yeah, this is the guy you let go. I haven't been able to decipher everything reading lips. I'm pretty good at reading lips, but most of the shots I've seen, you don't really have it head on, so I've missed a lot of it. But it's no doubt that he was in that terrific performance against the Mets that he had, that he was telling them, this is what you're missing. This is what you gave up. You gave all this money to Scherzer and gave all this money, to Verlander, and you put your eggs in different baskets with pitchers that perhaps have not worked out. This is what a big game pitcher is. And that's why I love Marcus Stroman. Is he as good as he likes to come across as being? Perhaps not. But he has a career WAR of 22.8, and that's not bad. His WAR so far, just through the first 2 months of the season, is 2.7, wins above replacement. And it's one of the few analytics that I give at least some credence to. I think some of the ways they calculate that, it doesn't really give you a complete picture. But if you're a starting pitcher and you have a WAR of 2.7 for the season, he could only make this better. And he followed up that performance with the Mets. It wasn't just a one-shot deal. Over his last 5 games, yeah, he had a clunker against the Twins. He's only 3-2. The other loss came when again, the team just did not score runs for him, and he pitched pretty well. But after that 8-inning performance against the Mets, he went and pitched a one-hitter against the Rays. 105 pitches, 1 hit against a Rays team that leads Major League Baseball in home runs and really has begun to mature as far as the lineup. People always think of Tampa Bay and the pitchers. That lineup is really maturing. Marcus Stroman made them look silly. That is the pitcher that you trade for if you're a contender. Because maybe it's not every outing, but when the spotlight comes on, Marcus Stroman had that series against the Mets circled. And then he was really happy, I'm sure, that he got to then pitch against the best team in Major League Baseball so far this year, the Tampa Bay Rays. He does shine. He did in Toronto in those 2 playoff years. He's not afraid to take the ball. He'll give you everything he's got. Even if he's having an off day like he did against the Twins, I think he only went 2 2/3, gave up 7 runs. I mean, it was a tough outing against the Twins. Every pitcher is going to have those kind of outings. But Marcus Stroman may be, of all the players in the National League, Marcus Stroman may have the biggest impact on pennant races, and not necessarily in the NL Central, but in pennant races, because he is going to be the most sought after pitcher after Shohei Ohtani. And I still don't believe that the Angels are going to trade Ohtani. I think they're going to try to hang in there and get every possible outing and every possible at bat out of Ohtani as they can, even if he leaves them for free agency in the offseason. But Marcus Stroman is signed through 2024. That's a pretty hefty price tag. But you think a young team like the Orioles wouldn't love to have a Marcus Stroman? Think the Rangers wouldn't continue to spend money and add a Marcus Stroman? Or the Astros? The Braves have been having some injuries with their pitchers. You know, say what you will, whether you like his attitude or not. He is a winner. Even if the box score says he is not, he is a winner. He's the pitching equivalent of AJ Pierzynski. Everybody hated AJ Pierzynski for the cockiness and the swagger until he came on your team, and then he was the best teammate you've ever had. That's Marcus Stroman. So it'll be interesting if the Cubs decide that Stroman is going to bring in the pieces that sort of are the cherry on top of the sundae of their rebuild that they had. Jed Hoyer, I don't think he's going to hesitate trading away a Stroman, making a tough decision. If he can get the right pieces, they're not necessarily going to the Cubs aren't going to necessarily say, oh, I'll take a prospect at A. And that might be part of the deal. But they can demand people that can step onto their roster right away or at the very latest in 2024. And they can sell high on Marcus Stroman and perhaps make the Cubs a real contender going forward after this season. It's not that I'm writing the Cubs completely off. And when you have a division as balanced as the NL Central, that's what makes it so exciting. Okay, you don't have this big Hollywood starlet team like the Dodgers, the Yankees, I guess you can say the Astros are that way, the Braves, teams that you really expect to win. I do think the Cubs have a chemistry where if you trade a Stroman, that could potentially disrupt that. But, I look at their decisions about letting certain players go, including up to, this with Contreras this past off season, little outspoken, Javier Baez's. These are guys that the Cubs have chosen not to keep. Maybe Stroman, as productive as he is, maybe that's not the veteran voice that you want on your roster. So when he's pitching as well as he has, why not go out and maximize your return on them? You don't settle for low A prospects, not for a Marcus Stroman. And the Cubs can hold on to him right up to the deadline and just keep getting in the offers. I guarantee people are calling already. But it's going to come down to teams like the Braves and the Orioles and the Phillies. I don't know that the Padres can bring him in. The Dodgers would probably have no problem adding even more money to their payroll to help stabilize their rotation. Who maybe move some younger pitches into the bullpen to get more seasoning. So Marcus Stroman, if you're a fan of the NL Central, that's a story you need to follow. If you're a Major League Baseball fan in general, it's absolutely a story that you want to follow. It's not so much that you want to see what Stroman is doing for the Cubs. I meant to look up what his win share is. It's a old Bill James analytic, a tool that basically calculates. It's a very complicated calculation. What percentage of a team's wins a player is responsible for? I would imagine that his win share here in 2023 is got to be through the roof. But Marcus Stroman is another reason to follow the NL Central. If the Cubs claw their way back into this, if the Pirates slide back a little bit, if the Reds maybe have that inexperience where maybe they're sliding back a little bit, maybe you keep Stroman to try to get that wild card spot. My guess is you trade Marcus Stroman so that in 2024 you're not talking about maybe earning a wild card spot. You're talking about winning the NL Central. That's why I love Central Intelligence and the whole concept of following the NL Central, not only during the season, but during the offseason, because it's easy to do a podcast about big market teams, big payroll teams, the AL East, the NL East, the NL West. It's really easy to do that kind of a podcast because you can just spew all the usual stuff that you're going to hear on all the major outlets and during games, on the Fox games or the Peacock game or the Apple Plus game, all those things they love to throw out there, all these flashy stats and things like that. But the NL Central, personally, it may be harder to win in the NL division in the NL Central than it is to win the AL East or the NL West. Because there is no expectation. There is no big payroll. There is no flashy players really on any of these teams. They all tend to be younger. They're all a lot of these teams are sort of resetting themselves and coming out of various stages of rebuild. NL Central is a fascinating division, and we're really happy that you are tuning into this. Again, make sure whether you're on the OK Baseball Podcast YouTube channel or if you're listening on Spotify, downloading the podcast, make sure you do a subscribe, make sure you do a like. If you want to share, that's always wonderful as well. We want to get the word out there and leave comments. Leave comments, on our YouTube channel. We look at it on a daily basis. We will respond. So we want you to be a part of this as much as we like putting this together. We're not doing it for us. We're doing it for baseball fans. We're doing it specifically, this podcast, Central Intelligence, for fans of NL Central baseball, who probably are tired of having their division ignored or dismissed. We're looking at it from a more realistic standpoint. So we talked about Marcus Stroman and what the Cubs might do with him. So it's kind of a Cubs theme. And in the background there, some of you may guess that it's a picture, black and white, of the early days of Wrigley Field. And you're partially right. It is. But I want to introduce a segment we'll do from time to time called Baseball Bedtime Stories. And this bedtime story is about Wrigley Field. Kind of. And in all honesty, when you think about the NL Central, if you were going to put your finger on one famous, iconic thing associated with NL Central baseball, it would be Wrigley Field. But this might surprise you all. Wrigley Field was not built for the Chicago Cubs. Yes, the Cubs have played here since 1916. But the Cubs didn't build Wrigley Field. Charles Wiegum, the owner of the Chicago Whales, you might notice the hat and the shirt if you're wondering what kind of goofy apparel I'm wearing on this. And the Chicago Whales, or the Chi Feds as they were more commonly known, were part of the late great Federal League. And someday I would love to do, an article or a podcast just on the Federal League. And in this situation, we can only kind of tie it into how their part in the building of Wrigley Field. But back then, it was Wiegum Park. We start, though, in the early 1900s. The Cubs were sold to Charles Murphy. And Murphy was pompous, he was loud, he was obnoxious. But fortunately for him, he was also rich and well connected. Like he was a family member of the soon to be President William Howard Taft. So he had some pretty good connections. But despite his money and despite his bluster, he was always finding himself in trouble. He was his own worst enemy. He began alienating his fellow owners that made up the National Commission. And back in the day, the National Commission was the iron-fisted rulers of all professional baseball, both at the major and minor league levels. He was always being admonished and being asked to apologize for publicly criticizing players, and he ripped them for what he considered, lazy play or their drinking habits after the games. But the first big thing that got him in trouble was that during the 1908 World Series, a famous World Series for the Cubs, he withheld the bulk of the home team's allocation of tickets so that scalpers could buy them up and that Murphy and the Cubs could realize a higher profit on the sale of World Series tickets. That certainly did make Cubs fans very happy, and it really outraged Major League Baseball owners, especially across town there with the White Sox, Van Johnson and Charles Comiskey. But if that wasn't enough, in 1912, Murphy started to publicly accuse the National League and the NL umpires. Back then, there was American League umpires and National League umpires of deliberately showing favoritisms toward the New York Giants in order to get them into the World Series. He felt that the league wanted the New York Giants because it was in New York. They really weren't drawing well. They were struggling financially. He thought that they wanted to do everything they could to not have his Cubs win, but get the Giants into the World Series. So you can imagine that, okay, people are already starting to plot his demise. But what ultimately led to the ouster of Murphy as owner of the Cubs, and mind you, the Cubs were turning big profits all during his stay there. So there was a really thin tightrope to walk along there. But the Federal League was originally a minor league, an independent minor league that had aspirations and announced in 1914 that they were going to try to elevate themselves to major league status. They were going to actively try to sign major league players. One way to have headed that off was to have a successful minor league team, an American Association team, start play in Chicago. That would have engaged the fans of Chicago much more than an unknown Chicago Chi Feds, Chicago Whales team. He said no, he would not give the permission. He says, no, this is my territory. I don't want a minor league team here. Another big reason that the National Commission, especially National League owners, wanted to get rid of Murphy and wanted to try to kind of neutralize Chicago as being a successful franchise in the proposed Federal League was that Charles Wiegum was well financed and he had committed to buy and operate the Chicago franchise. They even went as far as coming up with a plan. It didn't get approved, but coming up with a plan where they were going to phase out the Cincinnati Reds, the Philadelphia Phillies, the Pittsburgh Pirates, the New York Giants, and the St. Louis Cardinals from the National League and invite the three best financial Federal League teams who had not yet begun play as another major league: Baltimore, St. Louis, and Wiegum's Chicago franchise. They were going to take the place of these teams that were being phased out. And then we talk about the Cardinals. You have to remember that the St. Louis Browns owned Sportsman's Park and operated Sportsman's Park, and that's where both the Browns and Cardinals played. And back in those days, they easily outdrew the poorly financed Cardinals team. So the Cardinals of Anheuser-Busch and all that we know now, very much like the Cubs, when the Wrigley Corporation bought them, St. Louis struggled financially. Chicago was fine, but St. Louis was struggling. The other thing that the National Commission knew is that Charles Wiegum already had bought a tract of land on Chicago's north side. And he was determined he was going to build a brand new stadium there. So by having these deals and enticing him into the National League, they would have this brand new jewel of a ballpark for themselves, for the National League, for the National Commission, not for this upstart Federal League. Wiegum was not enticed to abandon the Federal League. He was committed to this experiment because he believed that in a lot of ways, some of the rules binding players to teams, reserve clauses, the way minor league players were just released and traded without and not really being paid very well. He was a really big believer that if they did things in a more modern way, that a Federal League could succeed. So he did a lot of things. One thing that he did, even before he started building Wiegum Park, is that he signed Johnny Evers, who's the Hall of Fame, Cubs, Tinkers Evers the Chance, famous guy. He was the player manager there. He took advantage of the fact that Murphy fired him and the Cincinnati Reds bumbled the chance they were going to hire him in the same position to be a player manager for the Reds. That fell through. So he signed him as the first big star for the Federal League to be their player manager. But the big thing that was going to make this a success in Chicago particularly was building this new stadium. Now, both sides tried to use every political favor and influence that they had to either delay and prevent the building of the new stadium or to get it through. Surprisingly, especially when you consider, you had Ban Johnson and Charles Comiskey, they're already in Chicago. You would think that, and you had William Howard Taft and his family, in essence, also trying to support Charles Murphy and the Cubs. Back then, you could have stakes in multiple teams. The Tafts were majority owners of the Phillies, but minority owners of the Cubs. It was a really murky water there. But Wiegum outmaneuvered him the whole time. And he used season tickets as currency. It wasn't cash payments, because that can come back and get you in trouble. He would offer season tickets to head off strikes by Teamsters, other unions involved in the building of the ballpark. They tried to strike. Wiegum, within a couple of days, had that strike settled. And also to make sure that potential real objections by residents of this North Side neighborhood as well as business owners, would not seek to have this project stopped. Remember back in the days when they were trying to get lights at what is now Wrigley Field, there was a lot of that stuff going on. And the real reason that this was really important, they broke ground on March 7th. Opening day for the Federal League was April 23rd. In just 7 weeks, Wigan Park was completed, and it was ready for fans to come in and root for the Federal League Chicago Whales. And it really helped that franchise and helped give the Federal League a toe hold in that first year. So all you Cub fans thinking Wrigley Field, this is ours? Well, it is now. But originally, Wigan Park was built for your competitor in what proved to be, unfortunately, a brief shining moment and an experiment that failed in the Federal League. And by the way, you know that brick outfield wall where now all the ivy grows and all the buckets heads roll out there in the bleachers? You can kind of see it in the background there. Again, you got people standing in front of it, but that brick wall that everybody loves now, it was the most egregious building code violation involved with the construction of Wigan Park, which is now Wrigley Field, became Wrigley Field after the 2023 season. After the 1923 season, that brick wall almost ended what is now Wrigley Field's birth and construction. So hopefully you enjoyed that little bedtime story. We'll bring them up from time to time. We don't want to necessarily always be telling, stories. Popular opinion, I was not there in 1914 and 1915 when Wigan Park / Wrigley Field was being built. I know it looks like I'm old enough to have been there. I really wasn't there, but I'm such a fan of baseball that I have these little tidbits. I can't tell you my blood type. I can't tell you my social security number. I can't tell you my phone number, but I know about the history of Wrigley Field. But I will always call it Wigan Park, and I wear my Chicago Whales and Chicago hat and shirt as a way to pay homage to the probably the unknown history of Wrigley Field, which is as a big a part of National League Central baseball as the teams and players themselves. Well, that's all for this week. Make sure you tune in if you're. We drop on Thursday, but again, spread the word. Like, subscribe, help us get this program into people's ears, before people's eyes. If you love a team in the National League, you root for a team in the National League Central, or you love the National League Central, join us and help us promote what I think is one of the most fascinating and enjoyable divisions to root for. I don't really have a horse in this race. I live in Pittsburgh. I love going to games at PNC Park. But I have seen more NL Central baseball than any other brand of baseball. And that includes growing up in New Jersey, where I was able to see and pick up on TV Yankees, Mets, Phillies. And on a good clear day with the right antenna, I could even pick up Red Sox games. NL Central has been a central part of my baseball fandom, certainly since the division formed, in 1994. And we hope that Central Intelligence and OK Baseball podcasts in general, there'll be lots of programming on our YouTube channel available on the OK Baseball podcast feed. There's all sorts of interesting stuff out there. Slasher Sports is not just baseball. It's college sports. It's cinema. It's lifestyle and culture. Make sure you visit our website there as well. I am your host, Steve Fett. I'll be back with another episode next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope your team has a week worthy of me talking about.